At the family dinner, my daughter-in-law raised her glass and shouted, "Cheers to this old hag who teaches us daily how not to raise our children." Everyone laughed and agreed. I stayed silent. The next day, my lawyer delivered the papers for the sale of the house. But let me back up because that moment didn't happen in isolation. It was the culmination of years of small cuts, tiny humiliations that I had swallowed in the name of keeping the peace. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 62 years old. For the past 15 years, I had convinced myself that family dinners were sacred. Every Sunday, without fail, I would spend hours preparing David's favorite pot roast, Rachel's gluten-free side dishes, and special meals for my grandchildren, Emma and Josh. I would set the table with my grandmother's china, light candles, and transform my dining room into something worthy of a magazine spread. That particular Sunday started like any other. I had been up since 6 in the morning, marinating the roast. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching, preparing fresh vegetables from my garden, and baking David's favorite apple pie from scratch. The house smelled like cinnamon and comfort, the way it used to when David was a boy and would race down the stairs, drawn by the aroma. Rachel arrived first, as she always did, immediately scanning the table with those calculating eyes of hers. She never said hello to me anymore, just swept past with a barely perceptible nod. David followed, carrying Emma and Josh, who at 8 and 6 were old enough to walk but still enjoyed being carried by their father. "Grandma Eleanor!" Emma squealed, and for a moment my heart lifted. These children were the light of my life, the reason I endured Rachel's constant disapproval and David's growing distance. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, kneeling to embrace them both. "Are you hungry? Grandma made your favorite mac and cheese." But even as I hugged them, I noticed Rachel's expression. That familiar look of disdain, as if everything I did was somehow wrong, outdated, insufficient. We sat down to dinner, and I tried to make conversation. I asked about David's work at the accounting firm, about Rachel's yoga instructor certification, about the children's school. My questions were met with short, dismissive answers. Rachel was particularly sharp that evening, correcting the way I cut Emma's meat, suggesting that my homemade mac and cheese was too heavy for growing children, commenting that the dining room was stuffy and needed better ventilation. I bit my tongue, as I always did. This was my house, the house where I had raised David after his father died when he was 12. The house where I had worked double shifts as a nurse to pay the mortgage, where I had stayed up countless nights helping David with homework, where I had celebrated every one of his achievements. But somehow, in Rachel's presence, I felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The breaking point came when I mentioned that I had been thinking about redecorating the living room. It was an innocent comment, something I thought might interest Rachel since she was always posting interior design ideas on her social media. "Oh, Eleanor," Rachel said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You know, at your age, is it really worth investing in home improvements? I mean, realistically, how much longer will you be living independently?" David said nothing. He just continued eating, as if his wife hadn't just suggested that his mother was approaching the end of her useful life. I felt the familiar burn in my chest, the sensation that had become all too common during these family gatherings. It was shame mixed with anger, disappointment wrapped in disbelief. How had it come to this? When had I become someone whose very existence was seen as an inconvenience? But the worst was yet to come. As we finished the main course, Rachel stood, up, wineglass in hand. Her cheeks were flushed from the bottle of Chardonnay she had consumed, and there was a glitter in her eyes that I had learned to fear. "I think we should make a toast," she announced, her voice carrying that false cheer that preceded her cruelest moments. David looked up, smiling, expecting something pleasant. The children paused their chatter, sensing the adult attention focused on their mother. Rachel raised her glass higher, swaying slightly. "Cheers to this old hag who teaches us daily how not to raise our children." The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to object, to defend me, to at least look uncomfortable with what had just been said. Instead, David laughed, actually laughed, as if his wife had just delivered the most clever joke he had ever heard. "Oh, Rachel," he said, shaking his head with amusement, "you're terrible." Even the children giggled, not understanding the cruelty, but following their parents' lead. I sat there, frozen, my hands gripping my napkin so tightly that my knuckles went white. 35 years of devoted motherhood, of sacrificing my own dreams and desires for my son's happiness, reduced to a punchline at my own dinner table. Rachel sat back down, pleased with herself, and the conversation moved on as if nothing had happened. They discussed weekend plans, Emma's upcoming dance recital, Josh's Little League game. I participated mechanically, nodding and smiling when appropriate, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. As they prepared to leave, David kissed my cheek in his perfunctory way. "Thanks for dinner, Mom. See you next week." Next week. As if I would simply reset, forget what had happened, and prepare another elaborate meal for people who viewed me as a burden, a cautionary tale, an object of ridicule. I watched from my front window as their car pulled out of my driveway. The house felt different now, emptier but also somehow cleaner, as if a toxic presence had been removed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through my house, looking at the photos on the walls, the mementos of a life lived in service to others. Wedding pictures of David and me walking down the aisle after his father's funeral, when I thought we would always be a team. Pictures of David's graduation, his wedding, the birth of his children. In every photo, I was smiling, proud, devoted. But when had David stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as an obligation? I found myself in my bedroom, opening the old cedar chest where I kept letters and keepsakes. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, were letters from Richard. Richard Morrison, the man I had loved before David's father, the man I had almost married before life took us in different directions. I hadn't looked at these letters in 20 years, but that night, I read every one. Richard had written to me. For years after I married David's father, and even after David's father died, he had reached out, offering support, companionship, love. I had always politely declined, believing that my duty was to David, that my romantic life was over, that good mothers didn't pursue their own happiness at the expense of their children's stability. The last letter was dated only 3 years ago. Richard's wife had passed away, and he had written to tell me that he often thought of me, wondered how I was doing, hoped that life had been kind to me. I held that letter in my hands and realized that I had made a terrible mistake. Not in raising David, not in being a devoted mother, but in forgetting that I was also a woman with my own needs, my own dreams, my own right to be treated with respect and love. The next morning, I called my lawyer. The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and disappointment. I sat across from Mr. Henderson, a man I had known for 15 years through various legal matters, and watched as he reviewed the documents I had brought. "Mrs. Patterson," he said carefully, "these are quite old letters. Are you certain you want to pursue this course of action?" I had spent the morning gathering everything: Richard's letters, old photographs, even my high school yearbook where Richard had written that beautiful inscription about always believing in my dreams. Mr. Henderson thought I was there about estate planning, but I had something entirely different in mind. "I want to find Richard Morrison," I told him. "I need to know if he's still alive, still single, still." I paused, feeling foolish. Still the man who wrote these letters. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses and gave me the kind of look that suggested he thought grief had affected my judgment. I suppose from his perspective, a 62-year-old widow showing up with love letters from 40 years ago did seem like the behavior of someone having a breakdown, but I wasn't having a breakdown. For the first time in decades, I was having a breakthrough. The story of Richard and me began in 1978 when we were both seniors at Madison High School. He was captain of the debate team, I was valedictorian, and we were the kind of couple that everyone assumed would marry right after graduation. Richard was brilliant, funny, and he saw something in me that no one else did. While other boys were interested in my appearance or my reputation as the good girl, Richard was fascinated by my mind. I remember the night he first told me he loved me. We were sitting on the bleachers after a football game, and I was complaining about how my mother expected me to become a teacher or a nurse, something appropriate for a young woman. "What do you want to be?" he had asked. "A doctor," I admitted, speaking the dream aloud for the first time. "I want to save people's lives." Most people laughed when I said that. In 1978, female doctors were still rare enough to be remarkable. But Richard just nodded seriously and said, "Then that's what you should do. I'll help you get there." He meant it too. Richard had been accepted to Stanford with a full scholarship, and he had already mapped out how we could both pursue our dreams. I would go to the State University for pre-med. He would study engineering. and we would build a life together based on mutual support and shared ambitions. But life had other plans. My father had a heart attack 3 weeks before graduation. Suddenly, my family needed me in ways I had never imagined. My mother, who had never worked outside the home, was lost and frightened. The medical bills were overwhelming. The idea of leaving for college seemed selfish, impossible. Richard tried to convince me to stick to our plan. "Your father wouldn't want you to give up your dreams," he argued. "We can make this work, Eleanor. We can find a way." But I was 18 and scared and convinced that duty mattered more than dreams. I broke up with Richard the week before he left for California, telling him that I needed to stay home and take care of my family. I enrolled in the local community college for nursing instead of pre-med, convincing myself that helping people as a nurse was just as meaningful as becoming a doctor. Richard wrote to me for months, begging me to reconsider, promising that we could figure out long distance, that love was worth fighting for. But I had already started dating David Sr., a kind, steady man who worked at the plant and had no ambitions beyond providing for a family. He represented safety, predictability, everything that Richard's dreams did not. I married David Sr. when I was 20, and Richard's letters gradually stopped coming. I convinced myself I had made the right choice, especially when little David was born. My husband was a good man, a devoted father, and if our relationship lacked the intellectual passion I had shared with Richard, it was comfortable and secure. When David Sr. died in a car accident 12 years later, I was devastated but not surprised when Richard reached out. His letter was gentle, offering condolences and support. He had become a successful engineer as planned and had married a woman named Patricia. He didn't suggest we rekindle our romance, just offered friendship and help if I needed it. I was touched but too overwhelmed with single motherhood to respond. David was only 12, angry and grieving, and I threw myself into being both mother and father to him. I worked double shifts at the hospital, helped with homework, attended every school event, and gradually built a life centered entirely around my son's needs. Over the years, Richard continued to write occasionally. When David graduated high school, when he got married, when my grandchildren were born, his own life had its share of joy and sorrow. 2 children, a successful career, his wife's long battle with cancer. The letters became less frequent, but never stopped entirely. The last letter, the one I had reread dozens of times since Sunday night, arrived 3 years ago. Patricia had passed away after a lengthy illness, and Richard was reaching out to old friends, trying to reconnect with people who had mattered to him. He mentioned that he often thought about the path not taken, wondered what might have been different if I had been brave enough to pursue my dreams. "I hope life has been kind to you, Eleanor," he had written. "I hope you found everything you were looking for when you chose to stay." At the time, I had felt a pang reading those words, but I convinced myself that I had found everything I needed. I had David, my grandchildren, a comfortable life. What more could a woman my age want? Now, sitting in Mr. Henderson's office, I knew the answer. I wanted to be valued. I wanted to be seen as more than a caretaker, more than a means to an end. I wanted to remember what it felt like to be cherished for who I was, not just for what I could provide. "Mrs. Patterson," Mr. Henderson said gently, "I can certainly help you locate Mr. Morrison. But may I ask what you hope to accomplish? It's been many years and people change." I looked at him steadily. "So do I, Mr. Henderson. That's exactly the point." He nodded slowly and made a note in his file. "I'll have my investigator look into it. It shouldn't take long. Engineers tend to leave paper trails." As I left his office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. Not the nervous anticipation of wondering whether David would approve of my cooking or whether Rachel would find something new to criticize, but the thrilling anticipation of possibility. For the first time since Sunday night, I smiled. That evening, instead of calling David to ask about his week or offering to babysit the children, I did something revolutionary. Nothing. I sat on my porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset, and allowed myself to imagine what Richard might look like now, what his voice might sound like, whether he would remember the girl who had once dreamed of saving lives. My phone rang twice. David, probably wondering why I hadn't called. I let it go to voicemail. For once, my time belonged to me. Mr. Henderson's call came on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after my visit to his office. I was in my garden, pulling weeds and trying not to think about the fact that David hadn't Returned my voicemail from 3 days earlier. Mrs. Patterson, I have some information about Richard Morrison. My heart started beating so fast I had to sit down on my garden bench. Is he? He's alive and well, living in Charleston, South Carolina, retired from Morrison Engineering. Apparently, it's quite a successful firm he built from scratch. He's been widowed for 3 years, has 2 grown children. And Mrs. Patterson? Yes, he's not remarried. According to my investigator, he's been quite active in the community. Volunteer work, some teaching at the local college. He seems to be. Mr. Henderson paused, choosing his words carefully. Available. Such a clinical word for what felt like the opening of a door I thought had been permanently sealed. Did your investigator find a phone number? Better than that, he found an email address. Apparently, Mr. Morrison is quite tech-savvy for a man his age. I took down the information with shaking hands. Richard Morrison, Charleston, South Carolina. An email address that looked like him somehow. Straightforward, professional, real. After I hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, staring at the piece of paper in my hands. What do you say to someone you loved 44 years ago? How do you explain a lifetime of choices that led you away from them and back again? I went inside and made myself a cup of tea, then sat at my kitchen table with my laptop. The cursor blinked in the empty email field, mocking my uncertainty. Dear Richard, I typed, then deleted it. Too formal. Hi, Richard, I tried next. Too casual. Richard, I finally settled on. Simple, direct. This is Eleanor Patterson, Eleanor Walsh, when you knew me. I hope you remember me, and I hope this email finds you well. I received your address through a mutual acquaintance who helped me locate you. I stopped, realizing how that sounded. Like I had hired a private investigator to track down my high school boyfriend, which, technically, I had. I know this might seem strange after all these years, but I've been thinking about old friends lately and wondering how their lives turned out. I heard about Patricia's passing and wanted to express my condolences, even though they're quite late in coming. True, but not the whole truth. If you're interested in catching up, I would love to hear from you. If not, I understand completely and wish you all the best. I signed it simply Eleanor, and before I could change my mind, I hit send. Then I immediately regretted it. What was I thinking? I was a 62-year-old grandmother reaching out to a man I hadn't spoken to since Jimmy Carter was president. He probably wouldn't even remember me clearly. And if he did, why would he be interested in reconnecting with someone who had broken his heart and then disappeared from his life? I spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous energy, cleaning my house from top to bottom, reorganizing closets that didn't need organizing, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind off what I had done. At 6:30 that evening, my computer chimed with a new email notification. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely click on the message. Eleanor, of course I remember you. How could I forget the girl who is going to change the world? I can't tell you how many times over the years I've wondered what happened to you, how your life turned out, whether you ever became that doctor you dreamed of being. I'm sorry to hear you're reaching out through intermediaries. I hope that means you're well and simply cautious, not that something is wrong. I would love to catch up if you're truly interested. I have to admit, getting your email was the best surprise I've had in a very long time. My phone number is below if you'd prefer to talk rather than write. I'm usually up until 10 most evenings, and I'm an early riser if mornings work better for you. It's good to hear from you, Eleanor. It's been far too long. Richard. I read the email 3 times before the words fully sank in. He remembered me. He wanted to talk to me, and he had included his phone number. I looked at the clock. 7:15. I could call him right now. Hear his voice. Find out if he sounded anything like the boy I had loved all those years ago. But I was terrified. What if his voice was different? What if we had nothing to talk about? What if the connection I remembered had been a figment of an 18-year-old girl's imagination? I poured myself a glass of wine and read his email again. The girl who was going to change the world. He remembered my dreams, my ambitions, the person I had been before I learned to make myself smaller. At 8 o'clock, I dialed his number, Richard Morrison. His voice was deeper than I remembered, seasoned by years of living. But there was something in the cadence that was exactly the same. It was like hearing a familiar song in a different key. Recognizable, but somehow richer. Richard? This is Eleanor. A pause, then a sound that might have been a sharp intake of breath. Eleanor? My God, it's really you. It's really me. How are you? Are you well? Tell me everything. And suddenly, impossibly, it was easy. The years fell away and I found myself talking to Richard as if no time had passed at all. I told him about David, about my nursing career, about my grandchildren. I told him about David Sr.'s death, about the challenges of single motherhood, about the quiet satisfaction of helping people heal. But I also found myself talking about things I hadn't discussed with anyone in years. The books I loved to read, the places I had always wanted to travel, the garden I had created as my own small refuge from the world. Richard told me about his engineering firm, about his travels, about the projects he had worked on that had made him proud. He told me about Patricia, who sounded like she had been a wonderful woman, and about their children, who were now accomplished adults with families of their own. Eleanor, he said, after we had been talking for nearly 2 hours, I have to ask, why now? Why reach out after all these years? I took a deep breath. Because I realized I've spent so much time being who everyone else needed me to be that I forgot who I actually am. And I remembered that you were the only person who ever saw me, really saw me, and loved what you saw. Silence on the other end, but not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Do you think, Richard said carefully, that might still be true? Heart did something I thought it had forgotten how to do. It fluttered. I'd like to find out, I whispered. Would you consider meeting me? I could drive up to wherever you are, or you could come here to Charleston. It's beautiful this time of year, and I'd love to show you the city. Charleston. I had never been to Charleston. Never been anywhere really, except for a few family vacations when David was young. The idea of traveling somewhere just for myself, just for the pleasure of it, felt revolutionary. I'd like that very much. Next weekend? Next weekend. After we hung up, I sat in my living room in the dark, feeling like a different person than I had been that morning. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about David's problems or Rachel's criticisms or what I needed to do to keep everyone else happy. I was thinking about what I was going to pack for Charleston. I had forgotten what it felt like to get dressed for someone other than myself or my family. Standing in front of my closet on Friday morning, preparing for my weekend trip to Charleston, I realized that most of my wardrobe consisted of comfortable clothes designed for gardening, cooking, and babysitting grandchildren. When was the last time I had bought something simply because it made me feel beautiful? I drove to the mall that afternoon, something I hadn't done in months. The sales associate at Nordstrom was a woman about my age who seemed to understand exactly what I needed without me having to explain. Special occasion? She asked, watching me examine a navy blue dress that was more elegant than anything I had worn in years. You could say that. I'm meeting someone I haven't seen in 44 years. Her eyes lit up. Oh, honey, that's exciting. Let's make sure you feel amazing. 2 hours later, I left with 3 new outfits, a pair of shoes that actually had heels, and a small cosmetics bag filled with products the young woman at the makeup counter had insisted would bring out my natural glow. That evening, David called. Mom, I tried to reach you yesterday. Rachel said you missed dinner with Emma and Josh last Sunday. They were disappointed. I paused, phone in hand, looking at my new clothes laid out on the bed. When had Sunday dinners become an obligation rather than an invitation? When had my schedule become something other people managed? I had other plans, I said simply. Other plans? What other plans? The question stung because it revealed how small my life had become in David's eyes. The idea that I might have interests, activities, or relationships outside of my role as his mother was apparently inconceivable. I'm taking a trip this weekend. A trip. Where? With who? I could hear the concern in his voice, but it wasn't the caring concern of a son worried about his mother's well-being. It was the anxious concern of someone whose convenient arrangements were being disrupted. Charleston, I'm visiting an old friend. Mom, you don't know anyone in Charleston. Are you feeling all right? Maybe you should talk to Dr. Williams about David. My voice was sharper than I intended. I'm 62, not 92. I'm visiting a friend from high school. I don't need a medical evaluation. Silence on the other end. David wasn't used. To me, pushing back. Rachel thinks you've been acting strange lately. She's worried about you. Rachel was worried about me. The same Rachel who had called me an old hag in front of my grandchildren was now concerned about my mental state. The irony was breathtaking. Tell Rachel I appreciate her concern, but I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. After I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to David. I wasn't second-guessing myself. I wasn't wondering if I had been too harsh or if I should call him back to smooth things over. For once, his disapproval didn't send me into a spiral of guilt and self-doubt. I was learning to trust my own judgment again. The drive to Charleston took 6 hours, and with each mile, I felt lighter. I had told David I was visiting a friend, which was technically true, but I hadn't explained the full situation. Let him wonder. Let him worry. For once, my life didn't need to be an open book for my family to read and judge. Richard had offered to pick me up at the airport, but I had chosen to drive. I needed the time to think, to prepare myself for seeing him again, and if things went badly, I needed an escape route. But as I pulled into the driveway of the bed and breakfast he had recommended, I realized I wasn't preparing for disappointment anymore. I was preparing for possibility. Richard was waiting on the front porch, and my breath caught in my throat. He was older, of course, his dark hair now silver, lines around his eyes that spoke of years of laughter and concern. But he was unmistakably the boy I had loved, grown into a man who carried himself with quiet confidence. He stood as I got out of my car, and for a moment we just looked at each other, 44 years collapsing into nothing. Eleanor. Richard. Then, he smiled, and it was exactly the same smile that had made my heart race when I was 18. You're even more beautiful than I remembered. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, a blush I thought I had outgrown decades ago. You're not so bad yourself. He laughed, and the sound was wonderful. Should I help you with your bags? That would be nice. As he carried my suitcase up the steps of the bed and breakfast, I marveled at how natural this felt. No awkwardness, no desperate attempts to fill silence with chatter, just two people who had once known each other well, settling back into an easy rhythm. I thought we could have dinner tonight if you're not too tired from the drive. There's a restaurant downtown that overlooks the harbor. The food is excellent, and I thought you might enjoy the view. That sounds perfect. He had reserved a table by the window, and as we sat across from each other, watching the sunset over Charleston Harbor, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation without anxiety. I wasn't worried about saying the wrong thing or disappointing someone. I was simply enjoying the company of a man who seemed genuinely delighted to be with me. Tell me about your life, Richard said, leaning forward slightly. I know the basics, facts from our phone call, but I want to know about you. What makes you happy? What do you think about when you're alone? When was the last time someone had asked me what I thought about when I was alone? When had anyone cared about my inner life, my private thoughts, my dreams that didn't involve making someone else's life easier? I think about the garden I want to plant next spring, I said slowly. I think about books I want to read, places I want to see. I think about the woman I used to be and wonder if she's still in there somewhere. Richard reached across the table and touched my hand gently. She is. I can see her. We talked until the restaurant began to empty around us. Richard told me about his business, about the satisfaction of building something from nothing, about the projects that had challenged him and the ones that had bored him. He talked about Patricia with love but not lingering grief, describing their marriage as comfortable and companionate rather than passionate. I loved her, he said simply. But I was never in love with her the way I was in love with you. The admission hung in the air between us, honest and vulnerable. Richard, that was so long ago. We were different people. Were we? He studied my face carefully. Because sitting here with you, I feel exactly like that 18-year-old boy who thought you hung the moon. I looked at this man across from me, successful and kind and still, impossibly interested in me, and I realized something that took my breath away. I felt like that 18-year-old girl again, too. The one who had dreams and ambitions and believed she could do anything. The one who had been loved for her mind and her spirit, not just for what she could do for other people. What happens now? I whispered. Richard smiled and squeezed my hand. And now we see what 44 years of living has taught us about love. That night, lying in my comfortable bed at the inn, I stared at the ceiling and allowed myself to imagine a future I had never dared to consider. A future where someone waited for my call not because they needed something from me, but because they simply enjoyed talking to me. A future where I was valued for who I was, not what I could provide. For the first time in decades, the future felt full of possibilities instead of obligations. I had been back from Charleston for 3 weeks, and those 3 weeks had been the happiest I could remember in years. Richard called me every evening at 8 o'clock, and we would talk for hours about everything and nothing. books we were reading, memories from our youth, plans for his visit the following month. I had started wearing makeup again. Not every day, but often enough that I had caught myself smiling at my reflection in the mirror. I bought fresh flowers for my kitchen table and cooked meals I actually wanted to eat instead of whatever was practical and economical. For the first time in decades, I was living for myself, but I had been careful to keep my transformation quiet. David didn't need to know about Richard yet. Not until I was sure of my own feelings and intentions. I told myself I was being cautious, protecting both of us from premature judgments and expectations. The truth was, I was protecting myself from David and Rachel's inevitable disapproval. That protection crumbled on a Tuesday afternoon when David arrived unannounced, letting himself in with the spare key I had given him years ago for emergencies. I was on the phone with Richard, laughing at something he had said about his attempts to learn how to cook for one, when I heard the front door open. "Mom, are you here?" I quickly said goodbye to Richard and hung up, my heart racing with the guilty panic of a teenager caught doing something forbidden. "I'm in the kitchen," I called out, hoping my voice sounded normal. David appeared in the doorway, and I could immediately tell something was wrong. His face was tight with the expression he got when he was trying to control his temper. "We need to talk." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Of course, what's on your mind?" He didn't sit down. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through it for a moment before showing me the screen. It was a photograph of me and Richard at the restaurant in Charleston, sitting close together, his hand covering mine on the table. We were both smiling, and even I could see how happy we looked together. "Rachel's cousin lives in Charleston," David said, his voice deadly calm. "She saw you there and thought it was interesting enough to share on social media." Imagine my surprise when Rachel showed me this picture of my widowed mother on what appears to be a very romantic dinner date. I stared at the photograph, a mixture of emotions washing over me, anger at being spied on and reported on like some kind of criminal. Embarrassment at having my private life exposed without my consent. But underneath those feelings was something else. I looked happy. Genuinely, radiantly happy in a way I hadn't seen myself look in years. "Who is he, Mom?" I lifted my chin, meeting David's gaze directly. "His name is Richard Morrison. He's an old friend from high school." "An old friend from high school who you're holding hands with in romantic restaurants?" "Yes." David's jaw tightened. "Are you having some kind of breakdown? Because this behavior is completely unlike you." "What behavior? Having dinner with a friend?" "Don't play dumb, Mom. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been acting strange for weeks, missing family dinners, being secretive about your plans, and now this." He gestured at the phone. "You're acting like some desperate woman trying to recapture her youth." The words hit me like a slap, but this time, instead of shrinking back and accepting the criticism, I felt anger rise in my chest. Desperate? For wanting companionship? For enjoying myself? For chasing after men at your age? It's embarrassing. "Embarrassing to whom, David?" He paused, clearly not expecting the question. "To the family? To everyone who knows you? Or embarrassing to you and Rachel because it disrupts your convenient arrangement?" "What arrangement?" I stood up, my hands trembling slightly with fury. "The arrangement where I'm always available, where I drop everything to babysit whenever you need me, where I organize my entire life around your family's needs, where I'm grateful for the scraps of attention you throw my way." David's eyes widened. He had never heard me speak like this before. "Mom, that's exactly what it is." I moved closer to him, my voice gaining strength. "I have spent the last 15 years being the perfect grandmother, the perfect mother-in-law, the perfect supporter of your life. And what do I get in return? I get called an old hag at my own dinner table. I get treated like a piece of furniture that you expect to always be in the same place when you need it. You're overreacting." "Am I? When was the last time you asked me how I was feeling? When was the last time you showed any interest in my life that didn't involve what I could do for you?" David was quiet for a moment, and I could see him struggling to find an answer. "I care about you, Mom. We all do. But this isn't like you. You're right, this isn't like me. The me you know is someone who gave up her dreams, her desires, her entire sense of self to take care of everyone else. But that woman was dying, David. She was disappearing a little more every day." I walked to the window, looking out at my garden, where I had spent so many hours trying to find peace. Richard knew me before I became that woman. He knew the girl who wanted to be a doctor, who had ambitions and ideas and believed she could change the world. And when he looks at me now, he sees her again. He makes me remember who I used to be. When I turned around, David was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. So what are you saying? That you're going to throw away everything for some high school romance? I'm saying that I'm going to start living for myself instead of just existing for other people. And what about us? What about Emma and Josh? They need their grandmother. They'll still have their grandmother, but they'll have a grandmother who is happy, who has her own life, who can show them that women don't have to disappear when they get older. David shook his head. Rachel is going to be furious when she hears about this conversation. The mention of Rachel sparked something dark in me. Good. Maybe Rachel should spend less time worrying about my personal life and more time thinking about how she treats the people who love her children. She treats you fine. She called me an old hag, David, in front of your children, and you laughed. For the first time since he had arrived, David looked uncomfortable. That was just, she was joking. It wasn't a joke to me. We stood there in silence for a long moment, the weight of years of unspoken resentments hanging in the air between us. Finally, David sighed. I don't understand what's happening to you, Mom. This isn't the woman who raised me. No, I said quietly. It's the woman I should have been all along. After David left, I called Richard. How would you feel about moving up your visit? I asked without preamble. Is everything all right? Everything is perfect, actually. But I think it's time for you to meet my family. Richard was quiet for a moment. Are you sure you're ready for that? I thought about David's shock, about Rachel's inevitable reaction, about the upheaval this would cause in their carefully ordered world where I existed solely for their convenience. I've never been more ready for anything in my life. Then I'll drive up this weekend. As I hung up the phone, I realized that for the first time in decades, I wasn't worried about other people's approval. I wasn't trying to manage their reactions or smooth over their discomfort. I was simply, finally, choosing myself. Richard arrived on Saturday morning, and I watched from my window as he got out of his car and looked up at the house where I had lived for 30 years. He was wearing a navy blazer and khakis, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence I had come to love all over again. I opened the door before he could knock. You look nervous, he said, smiling as he took my hands in his. Terrified, I admitted. Are you sure you want to do this? Eleanor, I've waited 44 years to be part of your life again. I'm not going to let a difficult family conversation scare me away. I had invited David, Rachel, and the children for dinner that evening. I hadn't told them about Richard, only that I wanted to discuss something important with them. The morning passed quietly as Richard and I cooked together. Something I had forgotten could be so enjoyable. He told me stories about his children, showed me pictures on his phone, and helped me prepare the same pot roast I had made countless times before. But this time felt different. This time I wasn't cooking to prove my worth or to maintain peace. I was cooking because I wanted to share a meal with people I cared about. Whatever happens tonight, Richard said as we worked, I want you to know that these past few weeks have been the happiest I've had in years. You've reminded me what it feels like to be truly seen by another person. I stopped chopping vegetables and looked at him. Richard, there's something I need to tell you before they get here. He waited, his expression patient and kind. I've never stood up to them before. Not really. I've spent years accepting disrespect because I was afraid of losing them. But I can't do that anymore, especially not with you here. If they can't treat me with dignity. If they can't accept that I have a right to happiness, then I'm prepared to walk away. Richard nodded slowly. And how do you feel about that? Scared, but also relieved. I've been holding my breath for so long, waiting for their approval, that I forgot how to breathe for myself. At 6 o'clock, David's car pulled into the driveway. I watched as he and Rachel got out, followed by Emma and Josh. Rachel was wearing the tight smile she reserved for occasions she didn't want to attend, and David looked grim. They knew something was coming. Grandma! Emma ran up the front steps and threw her arms around me, and for a moment my resolve wavered. These children loved me, needed me. How could I risk losing them? But then I caught sight of Rachel's expression as she noticed Richard's car in the driveway, and I remembered that love shouldn't require me to diminish myself. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Richard Morrison, I said as we gathered in the living room. Richard is a very dear friend of mine from high school. Richard stood and extended his hand to David, who shook it reluctantly. It's nice to meet you. David, your mother has told me so much about you. Rachel didn't offer her hand. She just stared at Richard with barely concealed hostility. Mr. Morrison? She said coolly. How interesting that Eleanor never mentioned you before. Actually, it's Dr. Morrison, Richard said pleasantly. I have a PhD in engineering, and Eleanor and I have been reacquainted for about a month now. I saw David's jaw tighten at the correction, but Richard's tone was so mild that arguing would have made David look petty. We sat down for dinner, and the tension was immediately palpable. Rachel picked at her food and made no attempt at conversation. David asked Richard a few perfunctory questions about his work, but his tone was interrogative rather than friendly. Only the children seemed unaware of the undercurrents. Emma chattered about school, and Josh showed Richard his new Pokemon cards. Richard was wonderful with them, asking genuine questions and listening to their answers with the kind of attention that adults rarely gave children. "So," Rachel said, suddenly, cutting through Emma's story about her art class. "How long is this visit going to last?" The question was rude and pointed, designed to embarrass both Richard and me. "I haven't decided," Richard said calmly. "I'm retired, so I have the luxury of flexibility. Eleanor and I are still figuring out what works best for both of us." "Both of you?" David's voice was sharp. "Are you planning to stay here?" "We're exploring options," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. "Richard has a beautiful home in Charleston, and I've been thinking about what I want the next chapter of my life to look like." Rachel set down her fork with a loud clank. "You're not seriously considering moving to South Carolina." "Why wouldn't I be?" "Because your family is here. Your grandchildren are here. You have responsibilities." The word hit the air like a slap. Responsibilities. Not relationships, not love, not mutual care. Responsibilities. "What responsibilities exactly?" I asked. Rachel glanced at David, clearly expecting him to step in, but he remained silent. "Well, the children need their grandmother. And we've come to depend on your help with babysitting and what? And you're needed here." Richard leaned forward slightly. "May I ask something? When was the last time any of you did something specifically to make Eleanor happy? Not as a grandmother or a mother-in-law, but as a person with her own needs and desires." The silence stretched uncomfortably. "I don't see how that's your business," Rachel said finally. "It's my business because I care about Eleanor's happiness. And from what I can see, she spent years prioritizing everyone else's needs while her own were ignored." "That's what mothers do," David said defensively. "That's what family means." "No," Richard said quietly. "That's what dysfunction looks like. In healthy families, care flows both ways." Rachel's face was red now. "I don't think we need relationship advice from someone who barely knows this family." "You're right," Richard said. "I don't know this family, but I know Eleanor. I've known her since she was 18 years old, and I knew her when she believed she could change the world. The woman sitting next to me is brilliant, compassionate, and deserves to be cherished. If you can't see that, then you don't know her at all." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children had stopped eating and were looking around the table with confused expressions. Finally, David spoke. "Mom, we need to talk. Alone." "No," I said firmly. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here. Richard is part of my life now, and I'm not going to hide that or apologize for it." David's face cycled through several emotions before settling on anger. "Fine. I think you're making a huge mistake. I think you're being manipulated by someone who's taking advantage of a lonely widow, and I think you're going to regret this." "You know what I regret?" I stood up, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I regret that Sunday 3 weeks ago, when Rachel called me an old hag and you laughed. I regret every time I stayed quiet when I was disrespected in my own home. I regret spending years believing that my job was to make everyone else comfortable while I disappeared." Rachel's mouth fell open. "I never—" "You did. And you've been treating me like an inconvenience ever since you married my son. I've tried to win your approval, to prove that I was worthy of basic respect, but I'm done trying." I looked at David, my heart breaking a little. "I love you. I will always love you, but I won't accept being treated poorly anymore. Not by you, and not by your wife." David's expression was a mixture of shock and hurt. "So that's it? You're choosing him over us?" "I'm choosing myself. For the first time in 30 years, I'm choosing myself." 3 months later, Richard and I were married in a small ceremony in Charleston. David didn't come, but Emma sent me a drawing she had made of Richard and me standing under a rainbow. Rachel had, predictably, forbidden contact between the children and me, but David eventually overruled her. Our relationship would never be the same, but it was honest now. David visited twice that first year. Awkward, but trying. He seemed to be seeing me as a person rather than just his mother for the first time. And while it was uncomfortable for both of us, it felt like progress. I learned that Rachel had filed for divorce 6 months after our confrontation. According to David, Losing me as a free babysitter had put enormous strain on their marriage, and other problems that had been brewing under the surface finally exploded. I felt sorry for David, but I couldn't bring myself to feel guilty. Richard and I moved into a lovely house near the water in Charleston. I volunteered at the local hospital, finally using my nursing skills in a way that felt meaningful rather than obligatory. Richard taught engineering classes at the community college, and we traveled to places I had only dreamed of seeing. On quiet evenings, we would sit on our porch watching the sunset, and Richard would tell me about the projects he was working on, the students who showed promise, the books he was reading. I would tell him about the patients I had helped, the garden I was planning, the woman I was still becoming. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked one evening as we watched boats drift by in the harbor. "Which part?" "Leaving everything behind, starting over at our age." I thought about my old house, about Sunday dinners filled with tension, about the grandchildren I saw less frequently now, but loved no less. "I regret that it took me so long to remember who I was," I said finally. "But I don't regret choosing love over duty. I don't regret choosing respect over convenience, and I don't regret choosing myself." Richard reached over and took my hand, the same hand that had trembled with nerves when I first called him, the same hand that had signed my name to divorce papers decades ago, the same hand that now wore his ring. "I'm proud of you," he said, quietly. For the first time in my life, I was proud of me too.